In the summer of 1942, the world was a furnace of steel and blood. I was Josef Allerberger, but everyone called me Sepp. I was a mountain boy, a carpenter's apprentice from the Austrian Alps, suddenly thrust into the southern sector of the Eastern Front. My first weapon was the MG-34. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but in the trenches it was a lightning rod for Soviet mortars. Every time I pulled the trigger, I felt like I was screaming my location to the entire Red Army. I remember the mud of the Donets Basin, thick, black, and smelling of decay. During a brutal Soviet counterattack, a piece of shrapnel tore through my shoulder. It was a minor wound, but it sent me to the rear for a few days. It was there, among a pile of captured Soviet gear, that I found it, a Mosin Nagant 9130 with a 3.5x PU scope. It was simple, rugged, and unlike the MG-34, it allowed me to strike from the shadows. I took it without permission. I wasn't a sniper yet. I was just a soldier who wanted to survive. But when I returned to the line and took my first shot at 300 meters, seeing the Soviet observer fall silently into the dirt, I realized my war had changed. I was no longer a target. I was the hunter. The cold in the east is not merely a condition of the weather. It is a living predator that waits for you to stop moving. I have spent 12 hours face down in a frozen furrow of a Ukrainian potato field, my fingers turned to leaden weights inside my gloves, my joints screaming with a dull throbbing ache that never truly leaves the bone. You do not think about the grand maps in Berlin or the glory of the fatherland during those hours. You think about the itch under your wool scarf that you cannot scratch, the way your own breath threatens to bloom like a white flag in the frigid air, and the terrifying silence of the steppe. You become a statue. If you move, the Soviet counter-snipers will find the shift in the shadows. If you lose focus, you are already a ghost. Through the Zeiss lens, the world is reduced to a small, sharp circle of clarity amidst the grey chaos of the front. This is where the psychology of the sniper begins to fracture. At 400 meters, I see them, not as a faceless mass of Bolsheviks, but as individual men. I see the steam rising from a tin of kasha, the way a soldier slaps his arms to stay warm, or the look of a young boy, barely 20, reading a letter from home. And then I have to kill him. In a bayonet charge, it is adrenaline and survival instinct. It is over in a flash of steel. But for me, it is a cold, calculated decision. I watch a man's life for minutes, sometimes hours, before I end it. There is an intimacy to long-distance killing that the artillerymen or the tankers will never understand. To pull that trigger and to remain sane, you must cultivate a deliberate hollow in your chest. I had to learn to stop seeing a person and start seeing a target, a geometric problem of windage, elevation, and lead. I became a craftsman of death, focusing on the mechanical click of the safety and the steady take-up of the trigger. This professional detachment is a heavy armor, but it is thin. If I had let the humanity of the Ivan in my crosshairs touch me, I would have dropped the rifle and walked into the woods to wait for the end. You feel the weight of it most in the silence after the shot, when the recoil has bruised your shoulder and the target has slumped into the mud. You do not feel triumph. You feel a grim, workmanlike satisfaction that the task is finished, followed by the crushing realization that you must repeat it tomorrow and the day after that. We were the executioners of the steppe, and our only reward was the right to keep breathing in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. By the time I left the line, I was no longer the boy from the mountains of Styria. I had become as cold and unfeeling as the steel of my carabiner. By early 1943, I had become an illegal sniper. My commanders knew I was using a captured Russian rifle, but they turned a blind eye because my tally was rising. I learned that a sniper's greatest weapon isn't his rifle, but his patience. I spent days studying the Soviet lines. I learned their routines. When they brought up soup, when they changed guards. I became a master of the invisible kill. I would use decoys, like a simple helmet perched on a stick or a piece of cloth fluttering in the wind, to trick the Russian snipers into revealing their positions. The Soviets began to whisper about a Schneidbrenner, a cutting torch, operating in our sector. I didn't care for nicknames. I only cared about the wind, the elevation, and the cold metal against my cheek. I remember one duel that lasted 6 hours in a ruined farmhouse. The Russian was good, but he was impatient. He moved just an inch to wipe his brow, and that was all I needed. My Mosin Nagant barked once, and the duel was over. I had reached 50 confirmed kills, and finally the High Command noticed. I was sent to the sniper school in Seattle to be turned from a talented amateur into a professional ghost. The cold wasn't just weather. It was a physical weight, a grey shroud that pressed against your lungs until every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. At minus 40 degrees, the world loses its colour and its mercy. We weren't just fighting the Bolsheviks anymore. We were fighting the very air we breathed. My breath would crystallize in my beard, forming a mask of ice that pulled at my skin with every movement. To stay alive, you had to become a ghost, an extension of the frozen earth. Our equipment was never meant for this. The thick, dark uniforms we wore were like beacons against the endless white of the steppe. I learned quickly to improvise. I took a linen bedsheet from a scorched cottage near the Don, tearing it into jagged strips. I wrapped my Mauser, my helmet, and my shoulders in those white rags until I looked like a discarded pile of laundry in a snowdrift. It was primitive, but it saved me from the sharp eyes of the Soviet snipers, who were just as cold and just as hungry as I was. The rifle was a constant source of anxiety. The standard army grease was useless. It turned into a thick, sticky paste in the sub-zero temperatures. If you didn't strip the bolt completely and run it dry, or perhaps it was a single drop of sunflower oil stolen from a village larder, the firing pin would simply crawl forward when you pulled the trigger. There is no sound more terrifying on the front line than the click of a frozen striker when your life depends on a bang. I would spend my nights in the bunker, or what passed for one, obsessively cycling the action, feeling for the slightest resistance, praying the metal wouldn't crack from the sheer brittleness of the frost. The threat of frostbite was a constant gnawing companion. We watched each other's faces for the white death, the pale, waxy spots on the nose or ears that signaled it was the end of circulation. If you didn't catch it in time, the flesh would eventually rot and fall away. I kept my feet wrapped in extra rags and stuffed my boots with the dry straw. But the numbness was always there, a dull ache that never truly left. You sat in your hide for hours, motionless, heart rate slowing, fighting the urge to shiver because even the slightest tremor could shake the crosshairs or dislodge a dusting of snow from a branch. In that frozen wasteland, the enemy's bullet was often a mercy compared to the slow, agonizing embrace of the winter. 1944 brought a different kind of war. We were no longer advancing. We were bleeding for every inch of ground. I returned from sniper school with a Mauser K98K und 6 Zeiss scope, the finest optics the Reich could provide. The Eastern Front had become a literal meat grinder. I saw things that haunt me to this day. Entire battalions vanished in the smoke of Soviet Stalin organs, Katyusha rockets. The Soviet snipers were everywhere now, including women who were more patient and deadly than any man I had faced. I remember a girl, no older than 20, who pinned down our entire platoon for a day. I had to crawl through a frozen drainage pipe for 400 yards to get a flanking shot. When I finally found her through my scope, I saw the determination in her eyes. It was a mirror of my own. I pulled the trigger because I had to, but the victory tasted like ash. My Iron Cross First Class felt like a lead weight. My heart was turning as cold as the Russian winter. I was no longer fighting for a cause. I was fighting for the men to my left and right, trying to ensure that at least some of us would see home again. The city was no longer a place for men. It had become a skeleton of iron and powdered brick. In the industrial ruins of the tractor factory, the air was a thick grey soup of pulverized mortar and to the sweet, cloying stench of the unburied. Every step was a gamble. You didn't outwalk. You slithered like a reptile, pressing your belly into the cold grit, feeling the jagged edges of shrapnel through your tunic. My world had shrunk to the width of my scope and the distance of a few dozen meters. I found my perch in the hollowed-out remains of a factory chimney. It was a vertical coffin, slick with soot that turned my skin as black as the shadows. From there, I could overlook the tangled graveyard of the assembly floor. Below me, only 2 rooms away, through a collapsed ceiling, I could hear them. The Russians were so close, I could smell their cheap Machorka tobacco. And here's the metallic clink of a mess tin. In the forest, you hunt from a distance. Here, you hunt in the same house. You learn to interpret the language of the ruins, the rattle of a loose floorboard, the scrape of a boot on a brick, because your life depends on hearing the enemy before he hears you. The dust is the sniper's greatest enemy and his only friend. It coats the lens, but it hides the flash. I waited for hours, my breath shallow and controlled, my finger resting lightly against the cold steel of the trigger. A shadow moved, a helmet, then the pale smudge of a face peering through a gap in the masonry. He was cautious, a veteran, as he paused, looking for the same thing I was. In that moment, the world fell silent. The distant roar of the artillery faded into a dull hum. I didn't see a man. I saw a target, a disruption in the geometry of the ruins. The recoil kicked into my shoulder, a familiar sharp punch. Through the scope, I saw the jerk of the body before it vanished into the grey debris. There was no victory in it, only the grim satisfaction of a mechanic finishing a task. But the shot was a flare to the enemy. Within seconds, the plaster above me began to disintegrate under a hail of submachine gun fire. I dropped from my perch, sliding down a pile of rubble that tore at my palms, moving before the mortar teams could find my range. This is the truth of the city. You are a ghost among ghosts, and the moment you become solid, you are dead. We lived in the cracks of the world, waiting for the next man to make a mistake. The even was never the clumsy peasant the propaganda posters back in Berlin depicted. To believe that was to invite a bullet between the eyes. Out here, in the grey ruins and the endless frozen thickets of the east, the Soviet snipers were the masters of the landscape. They were ghosts born of the tiger, men who could lie in a freezing swamp for 2 days without twitching a muscle. I felt their presence like a weight on the back of my neck. It was a constant gnawing paranoia, the knowledge that somewhere in that tangle of blackened timber, or behind a jagged slab of masonry, a pair of eyes was watching through a PU scope, waiting for the slight shimmer of my Zeiss lens, or the puff of my breath in the winter air. I remember one particular duel near a shattered railway embankment. For 3 days he had pinned our platoon down, picking off anyone who dared to peer over the lip of the trench. He was an artist of death. I spent hours motionless, my cheek pressed against the cold walnut stalk of my car 98K, my world reduced to a circular patch of grey rubble. The air smelled of cordite, wet earth, and the sweet, sickly rot of unburied bodies. Every time I thought I had found him, the clack of a Mosin Nagant would ring out from a completely different sector. He was playing with me. The chess match reached its peak on the fourth morning. I knew I couldn't outrate him, so I had to outthink him. My spotter and I rigged a dummy, a crude thing of straw and a tattered tunic topped with a captured Soviet fur cap. We moved it inch by inch, using a series of wires, mimicking the cautious peek of a man trying to orient himself. I didn't look through my scope. I used a small trench mirror, angled just so, to watch the tree line without exposing my head. The tension was a physical pressure in my chest. Then it happened. A tiny puff of snow erupted 500 meters out. A muzzle blast. The dummy's head snapped back as the heavy 7.62mm round tore through it. In that split second, I saw the glint. He had exposed himself, confident in his kill. I discarded the mirror, shouldered my rifle, and held my breath until my heart slowed to a dull thud. The crosshairs settled on a patch of mottled brown burlap that didn't belong in the snow. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched my shoulder, and through the optics I saw the shape slump forward, sliding slowly out of a hollowed-out log. There was no triumph, only a hollow sense of relief. I knew that tomorrow there would be another one, just as skilled and just as hungry for my life. On the Eastern Front, you weren't just a hunter. You were always the prey.